Hi everyone, my name's Fayette and this is my presentation on 3 effective ways to communicate with the deaf community. This is one of my favorite quotes by Helen Keller, a well-known author, activist, and lecturer who was born both deaf and blind. The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even heard. They must be felt with the heart. So when thinking about what to research for this term project, I thought about how important it is to effectively communicate with someone who has a disability. I then narrowed my focus on the deaf community due to my own personal experiences. This is my story. My dad is my hero. He has taught me what hard work, good family values, and respect looks like. That's why I'll never forget the day I saw my dad cry for the first time. I could fill 100 slides with my story, but I won't. Instead, I'll briefly tell you my story, starting with my dad is deaf. He was born deaf, and American Sign Language, or ASL, is his native language. He uses his eyes, hands, and facial expressions to communicate. One day, while on a flight back to California, my family and I were waiting to board the plane. My parents went ahead of us since people with a disability were able to board first. As I boarded the plane, I saw a few flight attendants around my dad, along with the captain. I was confused as to what was going on, but remembered the look on my dad's face. He had tears rolling down his cheeks. It looked as if he were completely lost. He was angry, frustrated, and just as confused as I was. When I finally made my way to him, I found out that one of the flight attendants said that he was getting violent with her because he was waving his arms around. Here's the thing, deaf people use their hands to talk. My dad was putting his bag in the overhead compartment when the flight attendant shut it abruptly on him. They were one of the first people to board the plane, so the compartments were not full yet. Confused, he started signing to my mom. The flight attendant misinterpreted this as him getting aggressive. My dad was merely communicating his confusion in his language. Sadly, no one else saw it that way. And instead of trying to understand and communicate with my dad, they stripped him of his dignity in front of other crew members, passengers, and his own family. That flight attendant's ignorance changed me that day. I promised to always be proud of my deaf culture and the language we speak. My goal is to show you how to communicate with the deaf community in 3 easy steps. Not convinced? Here are some other reasons to learn how to communicate with the deaf community. What if your child was born deaf? Wouldn't you want to communicate with him or her? Tell them funny stories or teach them valuable life lessons? What if you met the love of your life and they were deaf? Wouldn't you want to learn all about them and have endless conversations with them? Or what if you had an employee who was deaf? Wouldn't you want your work environment to be inclusive? Here are 3 simple steps to communicating with the deaf community. Learn, listen, and communicate. Step 1. Learn. First, learn the basics. Know how to sign the alphabet. It'll give you a good foundation for learning American Sign Language. Second, learn about the deaf community. Learning the language will give you a better understanding of deaf culture. And third, learn about deaf etiquette. Be aware of the do's and don'ts when communicating with deaf people. Here is a visual of the alphabet in American Sign Language. You can also look up video aids on YouTube. It really helps to get a better view of how to sign each letter. Next, learn about the deaf community. Who are they? A group of persons who share a common means of communication, or signs, which provides the basis for group cohesion and identity. Next, American Sign Language, or ASL, is used for social communication within the deaf community. And last, there does not seem to be a single distinguishing characteristic or trait that all members of the deaf community share. Rather, there is a complex set of factors which must be considered when trying to understand who the members of the deaf community are. Here is a list of some of the do's and don'ts when communicating with the deaf community. Do attempt to communicate with deaf people using the basics. You don't have to be an expert signer. Deaf people appreciate your effort. Don't assume all deaf people read lips. Some do, and some don't. It's okay to ask. Do try and communicate using pen and paper. It's welcome. Don't stare. Similar to eavesdropping, staring can be impolite. Do learn as much as you can about the deaf community and their culture. We're awesome. Step 2. Listen. The art of listening in the deaf world is not that different from the hearing world. Only thing is, deaf people listen with their eyes and not their ears. Here are some things to consider. Barriers. There are two main barriers in listening: physiological and environmental. Time. Deaf people have a polychronic culture. And nonverbal messages are critical in ASL. Barriers. To expand, we start with barriers. First, there is a physiological barrier. Profound deafness means that the person cannot hear anything at all. They are unable to detect sound, even at the highest volume possible. Oftentimes, people think that deaf people can read lips or are hard of hearing. This is not always the case. It's best to ask before assuming. Next is the environmental barrier. Just because deaf people can't hear doesn't mean that they can't get distracted by noise. Noise can come in many other forms. For instance, people walking in front of them as they are speaking to someone, commotion happening nearby, or a phone ringing, for example, the light flashing or vibrating. Time. Since deaf culture is polychronic, consider the additional time it takes to communicate with deaf people. Also think about the time needed for interpreters and/or closed captioning or subtitles. It takes time for interpreters to listen to the message, translate it, and then relay it. Additional time may be needed to read closed captioning or subtitles. Nonverbal messages. In American Sign Language, nonverbal cues or messages are very important. For starters, facial expressions are similar to tone of voice. For example, raising your eyebrows can signify asking a question, whereas widening them can mean that you are emphasizing an important point. Next, eye contact is extremely important. Maintaining eye contact with the signer means you are attentive and engaged. It would be best not to stare at their hands or turn around. Last, there is posture and body movement. These are important in communicating with the deaf people because ASL uses the body to speak. Remember to use natural gestures. One example of how the body is used is body shift. For example, telling a story uses body shift. When recalling a story, deaf people will shift from one side to another to indicate one person or the other. Step 3. Communicate. This is the fun part. To start, make sure you have a good environment set up. Face the person you are speaking to and make sure your face is in a good light. While conversing, it's okay to ask for clarification. Asking again is common when speaking with someone who is deaf. It's better to understand what is being said rather than assuming. If you are in a work setting, please make sure that an interpreter and/or closed caption or subtitles is provided for the deaf person or persons. It's an accommodation that should not be overlooked. If you find yourself stuck on a word or idea, feel free to use a pen and paper to communicate. Again, have fun. So, in conclusion, why is communication so important in both the hearing and deaf world? The answer is, it's everything. Communication fosters positive relationships in our personal and professional lives. It gives us the ability to articulate our thoughts and opinions. Communication also teaches us about ourselves and our relationships with others, and it allows us to discover new people and foreign cultures. Communication presents us with challenges and the opportunity to grow and lets us express our feelings and emotions. And most importantly, communication means the world to those who deserve to be heard, the deaf community. And remember, learn, listen, and communicate. And of course, have fun.